Chapter 1. The air in the grand hall of Pharaoh Djoser's palace was heavy with tension, as though the walls themselves were suffocating under the weight of despair. 7 years had passed since the Nile last flooded, and Egypt, once the jewel of the ancient world, was crumbling. Fields lay barren, villages starved, and even the gods seemed to turn their backs on the people. Pharaoh Djoser, resplendent in gold but worn with worry, sat upon his throne, surrounded by his advisors. Their faces mirrored his own. Lines of frustration, hopelessness, and uncertainty creased their brows. Every man and woman in that room knew that Egypt's survival depended on the Nile, and without its life-giving waters, the kingdom's days were numbered. Among the gathered council, one figure stood out: Imhotep, the high priest of Ra, and Pharaoh's most trusted advisor. He was a tall, lean man with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see through stone. Though known for his quiet wisdom, Imhotep was not silent today. "The people suffer," Imhotep said softly, yet his voice carried weight. "The gods do not ignore us, but we must seek their guidance. I have faith they will show us the way." General Neferu, a broad-chested man with a deep voice that echoed like a drum, stood with his arms crossed, his expression dark. "And what would the gods do? Will they move the rocks with their divine hands? Or plant the fields with their holy breath? No, what Egypt needs is action, not whispers from the gods." Neferu's eyes burned with intensity, as though daring anyone to challenge him. He had led Egypt's armies to victory many times and saw no reason why strength and force could not solve this crisis as well. His solution was simple: raid the neighboring lands, take what Egypt needed by force, and feed the people with the spoils of war. Pharaoh Djoser, caught between two of his most powerful advisors, leaned forward in his chair. His voice, though strained, held authority. "And yet the Nile does not flow. Do you propose we wage war against the river itself? We cannot bring life back to the land without the waters." Imhotep inclined his head, acknowledging Pharaoh's words. "The gods send us signs, my lord. In my prayers, I have seen visions, but it is your dream that holds the key." A murmur spread through the room as the council turned their attention to the pharaoh. Djoser's grip tightened on the arms of his throne. For days, he had hesitated to reveal the strange dream that had haunted him, fearing it would be dismissed as mere illusion. But now, with the fate of Egypt hanging in the balance, he could no longer keep it to himself. "Last night," Djoser began, his voice low and grave, "I stood beside the Nile. The riverbed was dry, as it has been for years, but something was different. In the distance, a figure appeared, tall, imposing, with the head of a ram and the body of a man. It was Khnum." The room fell into a tense silence. Khnum, the god of the Nile's source, was the creator of life, the one who fashioned humans from the clay of the earth. His appearance in a dream was no small matter. He pointed to the south, toward the source of the Nile. But then he vanished before I could speak. I don't know what it means, but I believe the god was trying to tell me something. Imhotep's eyes gleamed with understanding. "The god has spoken. He has shown you the way." General Neferu let out a harsh laugh, breaking the reverent silence. "A dream? This is what we are basing the future of Egypt on? A dream of some god who refuses to show himself?" The tension in the room spiked, but before Imhotep could respond, another voice chimed in, this one soft and sharp, like the hiss of a blade sliding from its sheath. "Perhaps the general is right to be cautious, my pharaoh. Dreams can be unreliable." It was Merenith, the pharaoh's young scribe, who had remained silent until now. She was an ambitious woman, always watching, always calculating. Her almond-shaped eyes were intelligent and cold, and her words carried the weight of someone who understood the delicate balance of power. "We are on the brink of collapse," her gaze sliding toward Imhotep. "If this journey fails, the people will not wait much longer for salvation. They will demand action." Imhotep held her gaze, unfazed by the veiled threat. "If we do not listen to the gods, then the Nile will never return. We must go south, to Elephantine, where Khnum's temple stands. There, we will find the answers." Pharaoh Djoser rose slowly from his throne, his decision made. "We will go to Elephantine. The gods have shown me the path, and Imhotep will guide us to Khnum's temple." Merenith bowed her head, though the faintest hint of a smirk touched her lips. General Neferu, however, did not bother to hide his scowl. "Mark my words," he growled, stepping forward. "If this journey leads us nowhere, it will be more than just the gods you'll have to answer to." Imhotep met the general's gaze calmly. The Nile flows through the hands of the gods, General, not through swords. Neferu sneered but said nothing more. The meeting ended with the pharaoh's decree, and preparations for the journey began immediately. The expedition would travel south along the dry banks of the Nile, following the gods' subtle whispers. The future of Egypt now rested on the success of this quest. As Imhotep left the palace, his apprentice, Passer, a young man of sharp mind and questioning eyes, hurried to his side. "Master, do you really believe the gods will answer?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. Imhotep smiled, his steps steady and sure. "Faith is not about certainty, it is about trusting that the gods will guide us when the time comes. And when we arrive at Khnum's temple, we will find the answer." Passer nodded but could not shake the feeling that Egypt's survival depended not just on the gods, but on Imhotep's own wisdom. Chapter 2. The expedition set out at dawn, a solemn procession that wound along the cracked and brittle banks of the once mighty Nile. Pharaoh Djoser rode at the front, his golden chariot gleaming in the early morning sun, though no light could pierce the weight of his burden. Behind him walked Imhotep, calm and contemplative, accompanied by his young apprentice, Passer. Soldiers marched in neat lines, their sandals kicking up dust as they moved, led by the ever-watchful General Neferu. Priests, nobles, and courtiers made up the rear, their faces a mixture of hope and doubt. The journey to Elephantine was not short, and as the days passed, the tension in the air became palpable. They traveled through villages where people knelt by the dry riverbeds, their prayers rising like the thin smoke of dying fires. Starving children watched silently as the pharaoh's grand procession moved through their desolate lands. It was a grim reminder of the stakes. Without the Nile, Egypt's greatness would crumble into dust. Imhotep walked alongside Passer, who cast nervous glances at the soldiers and the high-ranking nobles around them. The young apprentice had always admired his master's wisdom, but in recent days, doubts had crept into his mind. "Master," Passer ventured one evening as they camped by the river, "do you really believe that the gods will answer? The people are desperate. If we fail, we will not fail," Imhotep said, his voice steady, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon where the stars began to twinkle in the fading light. "The gods speak to us in many ways, sometimes through dreams, sometimes through signs. Khnum has shown us the way. We must trust in that." Passer frowned. "But what if the gods have turned their backs on us? What if there is no answer waiting for us at Elephantine?" Imhotep turned to his apprentice, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Faith is not about certainty, it is about trust. We do not always understand the will of the gods, but that does not mean they have abandoned us. You must learn to see beyond doubt." Passer nodded. As much as he wanted to believe, the suffering they had seen along the way made it hard to hold on to faith. While Imhotep sought to reassure his apprentice, other forces within the expedition were stirring. At the rear of the camp, beneath a canopy of woven reeds, Merenith sat with a small group of nobles, her sharp eyes gleaming in the flickering firelight. She had made sure to position herself close to the pharaoh's most influential advisors, knowing that whispers of doubt could spread faster than the Nile's waters ever could. "Imhotep speaks of dreams and gods, but is that enough to save Egypt?" she murmured, her voice soft and measured. "Our people starve while we chase shadows." One of the nobles, a thin man with a lined face, leaned in. "And what would you have us do?" Imhotep has the pharaoh's ear. "If this journey fails," "If it fails," Merenith interrupted smoothly, "there will be chaos. The people will look for someone to blame. And perhaps, in their desperation, they will look for new leadership." Her eyes slid across the group, her meaning clear. The nobles exchanged uneasy glances, but Merenith's words had planted a seed. She knew that if Imhotep did not deliver a miracle, the very foundations of Pharaoh's reign could crack. And in that chaos, there would be opportunity. Meanwhile, at the edge of the camp, General Neferu sat sharpening his sword, his eyes narrowing as he watched the figures moving through the firelight. He had little patience for Merenith's scheming, though he knew their goals aligned, for now. He had always believed that Egypt's strength lay in its military, not in priests who spoke to gods. His soldiers had already begun whispering among themselves, grumbling about the futility of this journey. Neferu glanced at the river, little more than a trickle in the moonlight. His hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. If the gods would not save Egypt, perhaps it was time for the strong to take control. "General," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Neferu looked up to see one of his captains, a young man named Senu, standing at attention. The men are restless. They're beginning to doubt that this journey will lead us anywhere. Neferu grunted, running his thumb along the edge of his blade. Let them grumble, but keep them sharp. When the time comes, they'll know what to do. Senu nodded and stepped back, but Neferu's mind remained fixed on the future. He knew that if Imhotep failed, the people would turn to force. And when that happened, he would be ready. As the days passed, the journey continued southward, the heat of the sun growing more intense with each passing hour. Passer could feel the tension growing among the soldiers and the courtiers, a heavy weight pressing down on them like the relentless heat. Finally, on the 5th day, they arrived at the island of Elephantine, where the grand temple of Khnum rose from the banks of the Nile like a forgotten relic of a time when the gods still walked among mortals. The priests of Khnum, draped in white linen and gold, greeted Pharaoh Djoser with solemn bows. They led the royal party into the temple, their footsteps echoing off the ancient stone walls. Imhotep felt the weight of the place as they entered the sacred hall, where a towering statue of Khnum stood in the center, gazing down at them with inscrutable eyes. The god's ram-headed form was carved from black granite, and his hands cradled a potter's wheel, the symbol of creation. We have come seeking Khnum's wisdom, Pharaoh Djoser announced, his voice reverberating in the vast chamber. Our people are dying, and the Nile does not flow. Imhotep, my trusted advisor, will perform the rites to seek Khnum's guidance. Imhotep stepped forward, his heart steady but his mind alert. He knew that the eyes of everyone, pharaoh, soldiers, nobles, and gods, were upon him. The moment of truth was drawing near. As Imhotep knelt before the statue, offering prayers and incense, the priests began their chants, their voices rising and falling like the rhythm of the river that had abandoned them. Outside the temple, Passer stood by the entrance, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. He could feel the unease swirling around the camp, like a storm waiting to break. Beside him, General Neferu stood with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the temple doors. If the gods don't answer, Neferu muttered, his voice low, I'll make sure Egypt finds a different way. Passer glanced at the general, sensing the danger in his words. But before he could respond, the doors to the temple creaked open, and Imhotep emerged, his face pale but determined. I have seen Khnum, Imhotep said, his voice steady. And he has shown me the way. Chapter 3. The air inside the temple of Khnum was thick with incense, the scent of frankincense and myrrh swirling around Imhotep as he knelt before the towering statue of the ram-headed god. His prayers were quiet but firm, his hands moving in deliberate gestures as he offered the sacred rites. The priests, dressed in white linen robes, chanted softly in the background, their voices blending with the flickering shadows cast by the torches lining the walls. Imhotep's mind, however, was focused on a single question, one that had plagued him since Pharaoh Djoser first shared his dream. Why had Khnum, the god of the Nile, remained silent for so long? 7 years of drought, 7 years of suffering, and only now had he revealed himself in a vision. The answer had to be found here, within the sacred temple. The cold stone beneath Imhotep's knees grounded him, reminding him of his purpose. He was not just a priest or an advisor. He was the bridge between Egypt's people and its gods, the one who had to seek answers where none had been found. As the final words of his prayer left his lips, Imhotep closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the scent of incense fill his lungs. His consciousness drifted, sinking deeper into meditation, until the room around him seemed to fade away. The chanting of the priests grew distant, like the murmur of the wind through the reeds of the Nile. Then, as if from a great distance, he heard a voice, deep and resonant, like the rumbling of the earth itself. Imhotep, the voice intoned. His eyes snapped open, but the temple around him had disappeared. He found himself standing on the dry riverbed of the Nile, just as Pharaoh had described in his dream. The river was nothing more than a cracked, barren expanse of mud, and the land around him was lifeless, desolate. Before him stood the figure of Khnum, taller than any man, his ram-headed form shimmering with divine power. In his hands, Khnum held the potter's wheel, turning it slowly as he shaped the very essence of life from the clay of the earth. His eyes, glowing with an ancient light, fixed on Imhotep. The Nile does not flow because the way is blocked, Khnum said, his voice like thunder. But it is not the will of the gods that has caused this. The balance of the earth has shifted, and the river's path is obstructed. To restore the waters, you must clear the obstruction. Imhotep's heart quickened. Where is the obstruction, great Khnum? How can we restore the balance? Khnum raised his hand and pointed south, beyond the horizon. At the first cataract, where the waters are born, the way is blocked by stone and earth. Clear the path, and the Nile will flow once more. The vision began to fade, the figure of Khnum dissolving into the air like mist. Imhotep's senses returned to the present, and he found himself kneeling in the temple once more. The answer was simple, yet the task would be monumental. He stood, feeling the eyes of the priests on him. The temple was silent now, the chants having ceased the moment his meditation ended. With deliberate steps, Imhotep made his way to the entrance of the temple, where Pharaoh Djoser, Passer, General Neferu, and the others waited anxiously. The moment he emerged into the cool evening air, all eyes turned to him. The pharaoh's face was filled with hope, while Neferu's was lined with skepticism. Merenith stood quietly to the side, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp, watching every move Imhotep made. "I have seen Khnum," Imhotep announced, his voice carrying over the assembly. "The Nile is blocked, not by the will of the gods, but by a natural obstruction at the first cataract. A great dam of rock and debris has formed, preventing the river from flowing north." A murmur rippled through the gathered nobles and soldiers. Neferu, his arms crossed, stepped forward with a frown. "So you're telling us the solution to 7 years of drought is moving rocks?" Imhotep met the general's gaze calmly. "Yes, Khnum has shown me the way. We must clear the blockage at the first cataract, and the Nile will return," Neferu scoffed. "You expect us to believe that a pile of stones is all that stands between Egypt and salvation? We should be preparing to take what we need from our neighbors, not chasing after fairy tales and wasting time with boulders." Before Imhotep could respond, Passer, who had been standing silently at the edge of the group, spoke up. "If Khnum himself has spoken, then we must listen. Isn't that what you always tell us, General? That Egypt's strength lies in following the gods?" Neferu's eyes flashed angrily, but Passer's words had struck a chord with the soldiers, who began murmuring among themselves. The general's authority, it seemed, was not as absolute as he liked to believe. Pharaoh Djoser raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. "The gods have spoken, and I trust Imhotep's wisdom. We will journey to the first cataract and clear the obstruction. Egypt's salvation lies in the Nile." Neferu clenched his jaw but said nothing further. He knew better than to challenge the pharaoh directly, especially in front of the court. As the sun set over the island of Elephantine, preparations began for the next phase of their journey. The soldiers gathered their supplies, while Imhotep and Passer worked with the priests to plan the expedition to the cataract. The task ahead was daunting, but Imhotep's mind was clear. Later that night, as the camp settled into a tense quiet, Merenith approached Imhotep, her steps light and her face unreadable in the moonlight. "You've stirred the people's hopes once more," she said softly, her voice smooth like honey. "But hopes can be fragile things. If this obstruction isn't cleared, if the Nile doesn't return, they'll need someone to blame." Imhotep regarded her for a moment, sensing the sharp edge behind her words. "The Nile will return," he replied evenly. "I trust the gods." Merenith smiled, a slow, calculated smile. "Trust is a powerful thing, but so is ambition. Remember that, when the time comes." She turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Imhotep alone with his thoughts. Khnum had shown him the way, and he would see it through. 4. The journey to the first cataract was arduous. Days stretched into weeks as Pharaoh Djoser's expedition pushed southward through the relentless desert heat, the dry banks of the Nile cracking beneath their feet. The river was now a thin, sluggish stream, barely alive, mirroring the state of the kingdom it had once sustained. Imhotep marched at the head of the group, his expression calm but his mind sharp. He knew the task ahead would not be easy. Clearing a natural obstruction of rock and debris at the first cataract could take weeks, even months. But he trusted the vision Khnum had given him. The gods had spoken, and now it was up to mortal hands to restore the balance. Beside him, Passer kept a close pace, his brow furrowed in thought. The young apprentice had always admired Imhotep's wisdom and faith, but doubts still gnawed at him. He couldn't help but wonder if they were putting their trust in the wrong places. "Master," Passer said quietly as they walked, "if the Nile doesn't return after we clear the obstruction, What will we do then? What will we tell the pharaoh? The people are waiting for a miracle. Imhotep glanced at him, his gaze steady. Faith, passer. We must have faith. Khnum has shown us the way. The gods will not abandon us. Passer nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in his heart. He had seen the people suffering, the children starving, and heard the whispers of discontent spreading through the camp. The soldiers were growing restless, and with General Neferu stirring their frustrations, Passer feared that this journey might end in disaster. The expedition reached the first cataract at dusk on the 12th day. The roar of the water could be heard in the distance, a low rumble that reverberated through the rocky gorge ahead. But as they approached, it became clear that the sound was not the Nile flowing freely. It was the sound of water trapped behind a massive wall of stone, pushing against the obstruction with increasing pressure. Imhotep stood at the edge of the gorge, surveying the scene before him. The first cataract was a natural bottleneck, where the Nile was funneled through a narrow passage between towering cliffs. But now, instead of flowing smoothly, the river was blocked by a great dam of boulders and debris, piled high over the years by natural forces. This is it, Imhotep said quietly, his eyes fixed on the obstruction. This is what Khnum showed me. Pharaoh Djoser, standing beside him, gazed at the blockage with a mixture of relief and trepidation. And can it be cleared? It will take time, Imhotep replied. But with enough men, it can be done. Djoser nodded, though the weight of uncertainty hung between them. Then we must begin at once. The pharaoh's command sent the soldiers into action. Under Imhotep's guidance, they set up camp along the riverbank and began organizing teams to clear the obstruction. Men labored from dawn until dusk, heaving boulders, shifting debris, and cutting away at the mass of rock that choked the Nile. It was grueling work, and tempers flared as the days dragged on. General Neferu watched the efforts with a growing sneer of disdain. He saw the sweat-drenched soldiers struggling to move the heavy stones and couldn't help but think how foolish this entire mission was. Imhotep might be a brilliant architect and priest, but Neferu had no faith in the gods. He believed only in strength, in the force of arms and will. And so, as the work continued, Neferu began sowing seeds of rebellion among the men. He whispered in the ears of the soldiers as they toiled, his voice low and venomous. Look at you, Neferu said to a group of men one afternoon, watching as they strained to move a particularly large boulder. Sweating, breaking your backs, all for what? A pile of rocks? While our neighbors grow fat with food and water, we waste our time here, chasing after the whims of a priest. One of the soldiers, a burly man with sunburned skin, wiped the sweat from his brow and frowned. What do you suggest? Pharaoh has ordered this. What choice do we have? Neferu leaned in, his eyes gleaming. Pharaoh's orders come from Imhotep. But what if Imhotep is wrong? What if there is no miracle? Egypt cannot afford to wait any longer. We must take action ourselves, by force if necessary. The soldier hesitated, but Neferu's words had planted a seed of doubt. Throughout the camp, the general's whispers spread like a slow, insidious poison, infecting the minds of those already weary from the endless labor. Meanwhile, Merenith, ever watchful, continued her own subtle manipulations. She spoke quietly with the nobles and priests who accompanied the expedition, fanning the flames of doubt with every conversation. If Imhotep fails, she said to one noble, her voice a smooth whisper, what will happen to Egypt? The people are already at their breaking point. There will be riots, rebellion. Pharaoh's grip on power will weaken. Perhaps, new leadership is needed, someone who can act swiftly and decisively. The noble shifted uneasily. And who would that be? Merenith smiled, a small, secretive smile. Time will tell. As the days passed, Imhotep sensed the growing unrest within the camp. He knew Neferu and Merenith were plotting against him, though they had yet to move openly. But he also knew that time was running out. The people's patience was thin, and if the Nile did not return soon, all of Egypt would descend into chaos. On the 7th day of their efforts, a breakthrough came. A group of laborers, working at the base of the obstruction, managed to dislodge a massive boulder that had been wedged into the riverbed. With a groaning crack, the stone shifted, and suddenly, a surge of water burst through the gap, roaring past the workers as they scrambled to safety. The camp erupted in cheers as the first sign of progress appeared. The Nile, though still choked by the remaining debris, had begun to flow again. Imhotep stood at the edge of the river, watching as the waters surged forward, muddy and wild but alive once more. He allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. This was the first step. The gods had not abandoned them. But as the celebrations continued, Imhotep's eyes drifted toward the darkening horizon. There was still much work to be done, and danger loomed closer with every passing day. Chapter 5. The first breakthrough in clearing the Nile's obstruction had brought a wave of relief to the camp. Water surged through the small gap in the rocks, a muddy stream that promised the return of life to Egypt. The cheers of the soldiers and laborers echoed through the gorge, and for a moment, hope lifted the spirits of even the most exhausted among them. But beneath that surface joy, a darker undercurrent remained. Imhotep stood at the edge of the river, watching the water flow, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He knew that this small victory was only the beginning. The obstruction still blocked the majority of the river's flow, and the hard work of clearing the remaining debris could take weeks. His mind, however, was not solely on the labor ahead. He could feel the tension in the camp thickening like the hot desert air. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, Passer approached Imhotep. His face was tired, and his usually inquisitive eyes were filled with worry. "Master," Passer said quietly, glancing around as if he feared being overheard, "the men, they're restless. I've heard them whispering. Some say that the water that's come through is a trick, a false hope. They don't believe it's enough to save us." Imhotep nodded slowly. "I expected as much. Fear and doubt are strong when people are desperate. And there are others fanning the flames of that fear." Passer shifted uncomfortably. "Neferu?" Imhotep's gaze remained fixed on the flowing water. "Yes, he doesn't believe in the gods or in this mission. He believes in power, in force. And he's not the only one." Passer followed Imhotep's gaze downriver, his unease growing. "What do we do, Master? If Neferu is stirring rebellion, we must be patient," Imhotep replied, his voice calm despite the looming danger. "Neferu is a man of action. He will make his move soon. And when he does, we must be ready." As night fell over the camp, the soldiers gathered around their fires, muttering among themselves. The success of the day had done little to ease their exhaustion, and the whispers of rebellion, carefully planted by General Neferu, had taken root. The general himself stood at the far edge of the camp, his arms crossed as he watched the laborers return from their day's work. His eyes were hard, and his patience was wearing thin. "We've been here long enough," Neferu muttered to Senu, his loyal captain. "The water that's come through is nothing. It's a drop in the desert." Senu nodded, his face grim. "The men are ready, General. They trust you. If you give the word, they'll follow." Neferu's jaw clenched. "I've given Imhotep enough time. He's a fool if he thinks the gods will save us. We need to take matters into our own hands." Senu glanced toward the center of the camp, where Merenith sat with a group of nobles. "And what of Merenith? She's been watching." Neferu's eyes narrowed. He knew Merenith's game. She was as ambitious as he was, if not more, but she was subtler, working through whispers and manipulation rather than brute force. For now, their interests aligned, but Neferu had no intention of letting her get in his way. "Leave her to me," Neferu growled. "She'll play her part when the time comes. But tonight, we act. The men are ready. We march on Thebes and take what we need from the temples and the grain stores." Senu nodded, but before he could turn away, a figure stepped into the firelight. Merenith appeared, her face calm but her eyes sharp with intent. "General," she said smoothly, her voice low, "I couldn't help but overhear your plans. You've done well to stir the soldiers, but I wonder if you've considered the consequences." Neferu's lips curled into a sneer. "Consequences? Egypt is dying. We can't wait any longer." Merenith stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. "True, but if you act too soon, without ensuring that Pharaoh's power is fully weakened, you'll find yourself not a hero, but a traitor. The people still believe in Imhotep. That small stream of water gives them hope. You must crush that hope first, before you move." Neferu's eyes darkened, but he said nothing. Merenith's words had a cold logic to them. If he moved now and failed to deliver a clear victory, the people might turn on him, and Pharaoh's loyalists would remain strong. "What do you suggest?" Neferu asked, his voice tight. Merenith smiled faintly. "Let me deal with the nobles and priests. I'll continue to sow doubt in Pharaoh's leadership. You ensure the soldiers are ready when the time comes. When Imhotep fails, truly fails, we will strike together. Neferu studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Agreed. As the camp settled into an uneasy sleep, Imhotep walked quietly among the tents, his mind racing. He could feel the tension, the quiet before the storm. Neferu and Merenith were plotting something, but the exact details remained elusive. He needed to act, but with care. If he moved too soon, he could lose the support of the pharaoh and the people. Later that night, Imhotep stood at the riverbank, the moonlight reflecting off the slowly flowing water. Passer joined him, his young face tight with concern. "Master, I fear we're running out of time," Passer said softly. Imhotep didn't reply immediately. He watched the water for a long moment before speaking. "The Nile is the heart of Egypt, Passer. It connects everything, the people, the gods, the land. If we restore the river, we restore Egypt." Passer nodded, though the weight of doubt still pressed heavily on him. "But what about Neferu and Merenith? They're moving against us." Imhotep's eyes remained on the water. "Yes, they are, but their strength comes from the people's fear. If we give the people what they need, hope, Neferu and Merenith will have no power." As dawn broke the next morning, Imhotep gathered the laborers and soldiers, rallying them to redouble their efforts. The flow of the Nile had begun, but the obstruction was far from fully cleared. The work would be hard, but with each passing day, more water would flow, and Egypt would begin to heal. But as the men resumed their labor, General Neferu stood at the edge of the camp, his eyes dark and calculating. He knew that time was running out, not just for Egypt, but for his own plans. And soon, the time for action would come. Chapter 6. The camp had grown restless. The trickle of water from the Nile had sparked hope among the people, but it was not enough. Every day the men worked to clear the blockage, moving boulders and debris, but the progress was slow. Imhotep could feel the weight of that tension, but he remained steadfast. He knew that the Nile would return fully in time. He trusted the vision from Khnum. But more than that, he trusted in the strength of the people. They needed a miracle, and he would ensure they had one. But General Neferu's whispers were louder now, spreading doubt and resentment among the soldiers. The men who had once followed orders without question now cast suspicious glances toward Imhotep. The nobles, who had once been cautiously optimistic, now listened closely to Merenith, who had subtly turned their doubts into something sharper, something dangerous. Imhotep gathered the key leaders, Pharaoh Djoser, Passer, and the nobles, for a meeting. As they sat in the large tent, the air was thick with unease. Neferu stood at the edge of the gathering, his arms crossed, his dark eyes watching Imhotep with thinly veiled contempt. "We are close to restoring the Nile," Imhotep began, his voice calm but firm. "The water is flowing. It is slow now, but every day the obstruction weakens. If we remain patient, Egypt will be saved." Before he could continue, Neferu interrupted. "Patience? We've waited 7 years, Imhotep. 7 years of suffering. This tiny stream of water is not enough to save Egypt. The people need more than your promises." The nobles murmured among themselves, their expressions uncertain. Pharaoh Djoser, seated at the head of the gathering, looked tired but resolute. "Imhotep has brought us this far, General," Djoser said. "The Nile has begun to return. We must trust in the gods." Neferu's eyes flashed with anger. Trust in the gods? Or trust in Imhotep? If the gods were on our side, Egypt wouldn't have been brought to its knees in the first place. Merenith, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward, her voice smooth and persuasive. "The people are growing impatient. If the Nile does not return fully, and soon, there will be unrest. We cannot afford chaos." Imhotep looked from Neferu to Merenith, sensing the growing conspiracy between them. He knew that time was running out, not just to clear the blockage, but to prevent the rebellion that simmered beneath the surface. But before he could respond, a shout came from outside the tent. "Water! More water is coming through." The gathering broke apart as everyone rushed outside. At the riverbank, a group of workers had dislodged another massive boulder, and the water was flowing faster now, surging through the gap with increasing force. The sight of it brought a surge of hope to the camp. The soldiers cheered, and the nobles watched with wide eyes as the Nile began to swell. Imhotep moved to the front, watching the water rush by, muddy and wild but alive once more. He could feel it, This was the moment. The dam was breaking, and soon, the Nile would be restored to its full power. But Neferu was not swayed. The general stood off to the side, his face twisted with frustration. He had come too far to be stopped now. As Imhotep watched the river flow, Neferu stepped forward, drawing his sword. The air around them seemed to still as the soldiers and nobles turned to see the general standing with his weapon drawn, his gaze fixed on Imhotep. Enough of this, Neferu snarled. I will not let you gamble with Egypt's future any longer. The time for action is now. Imhotep turned to face him. And what action do you propose? To march on Thebes and take what we need by force? To spill the blood of your own people? Neferu's grip tightened on his sword. If it means saving Egypt, yes. You've led us to ruin, you and your gods. The soldiers, torn between their loyalty to Pharaoh and the fear instilled by Neferu's words, looked on in silence. Even the nobles hesitated, unsure of who held the true power now. Before Neferu could make another move, a voice cut through the tension. Passer, Imhotep's apprentice, stepped forward, placing himself between the general and his master. You're wrong, Passer said, his voice strong despite the fear in his eyes. Imhotep hasn't led us to ruin. He's brought us back from the brink. Look at the river. The Nile is returning. We don't need war. We need to finish what we started. Neferu sneered. You're a fool, boy. The Nile isn't enough. It will never be enough. Imhotep took a step forward, his voice low and commanding. The Nile is everything. It is the lifeblood of Egypt. If we restore it, the land will heal. The people will be fed. There will be no need for war. For a moment, the camp was silent. The only sound was the rush of water, growing louder as more of the obstruction gave way. The river was surging now, stronger and faster with each passing minute. Neferu looked around, seeing the doubt in the eyes of the soldiers who had once followed him without question. He saw the hope in their faces, the belief that perhaps, just perhaps, Imhotep had been right all along. His grip on the sword faltered. Before he could decide his next move, the final boulders at the heart of the obstruction shifted. With a tremendous crack, the dam broke, and the Nile surged forward in a roaring wave, flooding the dry riverbed with its life-giving waters. The soldiers and workers scrambled back as the river, at last, was restored. A cheer erupted from the camp, louder than any before. The Nile had returned. Neferu stood frozen, watching the river rush past. His rebellion, his plans, all washed away in that single moment. Pharaoh Djoser approached, his voice quiet but firm. You have failed. Egypt does not need war. It needs hope. Imhotep has given us that. Neferu lowered his sword, his defeat palpable. He knew he had lost. Imhotep turned to face the gathered crowd, his expression calm. The Nile has returned, he said. Egypt will live again. The camp erupted into celebration, and as the river flowed strong and steady, Imhotep knew that his faith in the gods, and in the people, had not been misplaced. Merenith, watching from the shadows, slipped away quietly. Her ambitions would have to wait for another day. Passer stood beside Imhotep, his heart swelling with pride. You were right, he said softly. The Nile was the key all along. Imhotep smiled, watching the water rush by. The Nile is Egypt, and Egypt will always endure. Chapter 7. The camp still hummed with celebration as the Nile's waters surged back to life, sweeping away 7 years of famine and suffering. Pharaoh Djoser, Imhotep, and Passer stood at the riverbank, watching the flood spread across the desert, restoring the land to its former fertility. Soldiers and laborers embraced, their hope rekindled. But amid the joy, Imhotep felt a deep unease. Imhotep's vision from Khnum had foretold a restoration, but now that the water had returned so suddenly, something felt wrong. The gods were not known for giving without taking, and the power of the Nile was greater than any man could control. Passer, standing at his side, was still caught in the moment. It's a miracle. The Nile has returned. The gods truly favor us. Imhotep nodded, though unease gnawed at him. Perhaps, but the gods are never simple, there is always a price. As night descended, Imhotep stayed by the river, watching as the water, once rushing, became unnaturally still. The surface shimmered in the moonlight, but there was no movement, no sound. The river seemed to have frozen in time. Then, without warning, the water began to ripple violently. Imhotep stepped back, his pulse quickening as something dark and ancient stirred within the Nile. A shape began to rise from the water, a towering figure of flowing blackness, with eyes glowing a cold blue. This being, whatever it was, had the form of a man, yet its essence seemed woven from the very waters of the Nile. Imhotep, the figure's voice boomed, deep and terrible. You sought to restore me, but you have unleashed more than you can understand. Imhotep's heart raced. Who are you? I am the Nile. I am the force that gives life and takes it away. For centuries, the gods kept me bound, but your efforts have set me free. And now, Egypt will drown. Imhotep's blood ran cold. The vision from Khnum, it had not been a blessing. It was a warning. The Nile's natural obstruction had not been a random event, it had been a seal, placed there to contain this ancient, destructive force. No, Imhotep whispered. I won't let this happen. The figure's watery form began to swell, the river rising with it. The balance has been broken. Now Egypt will pay the price. As the dark waters surged higher, General Neferu and Senu rushed to the riverbank, their faces twisted in shock and fear. What madness is this? Neferu demanded, his usual confidence shattered by the sight of the rising river. He turned on Imhotep, fury in his eyes. You've brought us to ruin. You were supposed to save Egypt, not doom it. Imhotep faced Neferu with a calm he no longer truly felt. There was no way to foresee this, but I will stop it. Neferu drew his sword, his frustration boiling over. Stop it? You've unleashed a curse upon us. This is on you. I won't let Egypt fall while you stand by. Just as Neferu stepped toward him, Merenith appeared from the shadows, her expression calculating as always. She had watched events unfold from a distance, always assessing the right moment to act. This isn't the time for blame, Merenith said sharply, her eyes darting between the swelling river and the panicked soldiers. If we don't stop this now, none of us will live to see tomorrow. Neferu's grip on his sword tightened. What do you propose? You've been manipulating the situation since we began this journey. She smiled faintly, unbothered by his accusation. We need to evacuate the camp immediately. That's all we can do. If we lose men here, the kingdom will collapse. Imhotep shook his head. Running won't help. This flood will not stop at the camp. It will drown the entire kingdom unless I can reseal the Nile. Merenith's cold eyes met his. And how do you intend to do that? You've already failed once. Passer, who had been silently absorbing the scene, stepped forward. Imhotep didn't fail. We still have time to fix this. Neferu scoffed. Fix it? The Nile is alive. Look at it. There's no stopping it now. The answer lay not in fighting the river, but in understanding the balance Khnum had spoken of. His vision had shown him the way, but he had misunderstood. The blockage had been a seal, and only the gods could restore it. The temple, Imhotep said suddenly, turning toward Pharaoh Djoser, who had just arrived, out of breath, from his tent. We must return to the temple of Khnum. It's the only place where the balance can be restored. Neferu's eyes widened in disbelief. You think another prayer will fix this? It's the only way. The seal wasn't meant to be broken. If we act quickly, we can restore it. Djoser, torn between trust and fear, looked to Imhotep. Then we will go. Lead the way. The group raced through the camp as the water continued to rise, spilling over the riverbank and flooding the tents. Soldiers and nobles scattered, desperately trying to escape the growing deluge. As they reached the temple of Khnum, Imhotep wasted no time. He knelt before the towering statue of the ram-headed god, offering up a fervent prayer. Great Khnum, Imhotep called out, we have made a grave mistake. The forces we sought to control were never meant to be unleashed. Help us restore the balance before Egypt is lost. For a long, terrible moment, there was only silence. The water outside the temple continued to rise, and panic gripped the hearts of all who stood there. Then, with a low rumble, the ground beneath the temple shook. The statue of Khnum began to glow with an ethereal light, and a deep voice echoed through the chamber. The balance must be restored, Khnum's voice rumbled. But a price must be paid. Imhotep's heart sank. What price? The light around the statue intensified, and the voice of Khnum filled the temple once more. A life for a life. The one who broke the seal must offer themselves to restore it. Imhotep understood immediately. The price was his own life. Without hesitation, he rose to his feet, meeting Djoser's shocked gaze. This is the only way. I must give my life to seal the Nile and save Egypt. Passer's eyes filled with tears. No, master, there must be another way, but Imhotep shook his head. This is the way of the gods, balance must be maintained. Before anyone could stop him, Imhotep stepped into the center of the temple, his arms raised toward the statue of Khnum. The light enveloped him, and with a final surge of energy, the river outside began to recede. The waters calmed, and the destructive force of the Nile was contained once more. But this time, the Nile was not sealed entirely. The natural flow of the river resumed, gentle and life-giving, as it had been before the famine. Imhotep's sacrifice ensured that the Nile's destructive force would be held in check, while allowing the annual floods to nourish Egypt. Imhotep's body crumpled to the floor, lifeless, as the light from the statue faded. The Nile had been saved, and with it, Egypt's future. Djoser, Passer, Neferu, and Merenith stood in stunned silence, the weight of Imhotep's sacrifice settling over them. The famine would soon end, and Egypt would thrive once more, but the cost had been heavy. Passer knelt beside his fallen master. Djoser placed a hand on Passer's shoulder. Imhotep's name will be remembered forever. Egypt owes him everything. As the sun rose over the now calm river, the Nile flowed once more, not as a force of destruction, but as the lifeblood of Egypt, restored by Imhotep's final act of faith.